Are your villains falling flat? Maybe their motivations feel meaningless, or their relationships with other characters are forced. Shera in the Princess of Power is a wonderful example of some really well thought out villains. So in this video, I'm going to be breaking down 3 of their character arcs and showing you what you can learn from them. So let's get started. Sup peoples, and welcome back to another video. I really enjoyed rewatching Shera in the Princess of Power this year, and on my rewatch I realized just how amazing some of the character arcs are. Catra in particular blew my mind on the second time through, and I think that we can learn a lot from her character, but not just her. Today I'm also going to be talking about Hordak and Shadow Weaver. I have a lot of notes for this video, so if I am referring to this, that is why. Okay, example A is going to be Catra. Scorpia is a close second, but I'd say Catra is my favorite character. I just find her so fascinating, and I feel like her character arc, evolution, and most of all, motivation are just really interesting. She's a great villain, and as someone who loves villains, check out my How to Write Villains video up above if you want proof. It was really exciting to see a villainous character given this much attention. Some stories benefit from having rather flat, simple villains, like a Disney story, when all you really need is an antagonist pushing the characters along. But I personally am a fan of really elaborate, in-depth villains that are just as much characters as the protagonists are. The foundation of Catra's arc is her relationship with Adora, and her relationship with the other characters in the story, which her relationship with Adora directly influences. The first thing that I want to talk about with Catra is relationships and backstory, specifically how they connect. If we start at the beginning, Catra and Adora grew up together, and through flashbacks throughout the series, conversations they have with other characters, and just the dynamics that we see them have with characters, we realize the juxtaposition of Catra and Adora's lives in the Horde. Though they grew up together and were best friends and always supported each other, Adora was lifted up by the people around her, whereas Catra was pushed down. This obviously had profound effects on both of them. Adora was very confident and self-assured, and this allowed her to be the best version of herself and have enough confidence to take on difficult missions. Catra, on the other hand, built up an exterior where she pretended that she didn't care what anybody thought of her. This is a great thing that, well, it's not great, it's bad, but it's great for villains. This is very common in villains. And I think that the reality of Catra and the projection of Catra that she uses to protect herself are very different. And the projection is much more the villain than she is. I'm not saying that she doesn't do bad things. She does a lot of things that are unforgivable throughout the course of the series. But there is a difference between her internal thoughts and the person that she presents to the public eye. Going back to backstory, let's just talk about Shadow Weaver for a second. I'm going to get more into her role in the story later on when I do a deep dive into her personality as a character and as a villain. But for now, we can just think about the effect that she had on Catra. Growing up under Shadow Weaver, Catra and Adora had completely opposite lives, even though they were very similar. And the way that Adora was aided and Catra was the opposite show as Catra learns to do things for herself. She is very independent. She doesn't think she needs anybody. And this core backstory and then the relationships that spring from it are what make her such an interesting character. Her relationship with Adora is a mixture of love and jealousy. Her relationship with Shadow Weaver is both one of hatred and longing. She wishes that Shadow Weaver cared about her. So when Shadow Weaver pretends to care about her, it's very easy to fall into that trap. And we instantly see this side of Catra that she tries for no one to see. She is not a character without a heart. She's a character with too much of a heart, and she's trying to kill her heart because it hurts. That sounds very melodramatic, but over the course of, I think it might have been 5 seasons, the show can illustrate it very well. The person that Catra projects to the world, this uncaring, callous, cunning caricature of herself, isn't the real Catra. It is elements of her. It is all the strongest elements of her, and I say strong more within air quotes. It's what she thinks is strong, that she is showing people. But then she hides away all of the other things. She's surrounded herself with thorny walls so that she can't get hurt again. She was already doing this, but then when you get into the current storyline, where you pick up on the first season, we can see the profound effect of Adora leaving to join the rebellion. No longer are Catra's fears of being unwanted just fears. Her worst fear comes to pass. And this only solidifies all the lies and misconceptions that everyone else had been feeding her. That no one wants her, that she is useless, that she will never amount to anything. So when her best friend, the only person who never told her those things, leaves her behind, she has nothing to hold her back from becoming the villain that we see her become over the course of the story. Catra is, at her core, very bitter. And a lot of her actions come back to this bitterness that she feels towards almost every character in the show. Catra is a perfect example of how relationships can shape you as a person. Her relationship with Shadow Weaver, her relationship with Adora, and then throughout this later part of the series, her relationships with Scorpia and Entrapta. Entrapta, who she manipulates and then betrays. And Scorpia, who really does want to be her friend. Really, truly wants that. But Catra refuses to allow herself to have a friend because she's so afraid of getting hurt or of needing someone. She views friendship as weakness and pain. It's her desperation that makes her dangerous. The way that she both feels the need to push everyone away and yet clings wholeheartedly to her relationship with Adora. We can see this mirroring of her motivation in scenes where she pushes someone away or is mean or cruel or callous, and then scenes when she's alone and we see her break down. Catra is not happy, and she doesn't know how to be happy. She keeps pushing away her happiness. This is just such an interesting way of making her feel integral to the story. Very often, a villain is thrust into a plot line just because you need someone to push the plot along. But Catra doesn't just push the plot along. She pushes the characters along. She forces them to make hard decisions, like when Glimmer has to choose whether to ally herself with Shadow Weaver or not. She forces Adora to decide how far she's willing to go. Is she willing to kill her best friend to stop her? Or does she still think that Catra can be redeemed? A villain shouldn't feel like peace on a chessboard. They have to feel like a character. They have to bring emotions to mind, and they should be just as interesting as your protagonist. In some ways, they can be even more interesting, because villains are allowed to push the envelope more than a protagonist often is. If you're writing a story where the protagonist is just supposed to be good, then they can't do a lot of things the villain can. And this is why we find them so compelling. Villains are incredibly interesting characters. They have a lot of opportunity to push the envelope, to explore morality, and to be really fascinating and interesting parts of the story. Almost all my favorite series, shows, and books, no matter what they are, have really interesting villains. And I think that this is because they are made characters in their own right. They have in-depth motivations. They have multiple parts to their personality. They have relationships that evolve throughout the series. And I don't just mean romantic ones. Yes, Catra and Adora end up together, and that is a big part of their relationship. This love that Catra felt, and then the betrayal when Adora left. And the way that Adora feels betrayed by Catra. There's a lot to unpack in their relationship. But even if it didn't end with a romantic relationship, it would still be really compelling. Catra's motivation is not to further the Horde's interests. It's always to further her own. And her interests just happen to be within the Horde's system. She wants to prove everybody wrong. She wants to prove that she is someone, she will amount to something, and that she is not worthless. And she proves that time and time again over the course of the series. But when you surround yourself with people who you won't let get close to you, or who are just as conniving and cold-hearted as the projection that you put to the world, you're never going to get that satisfaction. And this is what Catra slowly realizes. When she's winning, she's still miserable. She's not making the decisions she's making for herself. When she's given a chance at happiness and power outside of the Horde, she throws it away to go back because of Adora. She's doing everything for other people because of what other people think of her. She doesn't care if she wins. She needs Shadow Weaver to see her win. She needs Adora to see her win. She needs Hordak to see her win. And this is where it becomes really interesting. Because for a character whose whole thing is that she doesn't need relationships, she's very reliant on her relationships. And it's this sort of complication of a person's thoughts, motivations, and actual desires that makes a character compelling. A character should have layers. On the outside, Catra is callous, and on the inside, she is not. She's very caring. If something had happened to Scorpia on one of their missions where they were just forced to work together, she would have been very unhappy, but she would never admit that to herself. We see her realize in the later season that when she's winning, she is at her unhappiest. And I think, personally, that part of this is because she's realized that when she's winning, Adora is losing. And through all of this, she still cares about Adora greatly, even if she will never admit that to herself. Catra, very early on in the series, embraced being the villain. And this is something that actively stands in the way of her redemption. When you think of yourself as the villain, of course you're going to keep doing villainous things. If you think of yourself as evil, you don't think you could be redeemed. You don't think the good guys will ever accept you. So the more evil that Catra thinks she is, the more bad things she does. The more evil she thinks she is, the less likely she is to turn good. It's a cycle that repeats itself. It's like a self-prophecy. But one of the things that I like best about Catra's arc is that she doesn't just switch sides and her personality suddenly changes. Though she initially aligns herself with Horde Prime, it seems like she's only doing it because that's what she does. Her heart is never in it, and she's too worried about Adora to really want to help Horde Prime. This is the first time it felt like she wasn't in control at all, and that she knew she couldn't take Horde Prime out if things went wrong. She's out of her depth. So it makes sense for her to eventually realize this and decide to take the action she's been wanting to take all along, and help Adora. Saving Glimmer, though, doesn't mean that suddenly she switches sides and is completely good. One of the things that I like most about Catra's arc is the fact that just because she did one good thing doesn't mean being good is easy now. She doesn't switch sides and then suddenly become a different character. I've always found it annoying when shows do that because helping the good guys doesn't make you a good guy. There's so many things that villains have to do within themselves and with other people before they can really be considered redeemed. So once she is a hero, she isn't ready to trust Adora, and she hasn't fully left her old ways behind. Her abandonment issues are still running rampant, and we see this when she decides to leave because she's just convinced that they don't actually care about her. But in the end, when she realizes that Adora is once again in danger, she goes back. And that is the moment that her character arc becomes a redemption arc. That's the moment that she decides, yes, I still have problems. Yes, I still have villainous tendencies, but it is worth the effort to work through them to be able to go and help my friend. Long story short, a villain's relationships with other characters are a wonderful source of motivation, personality traits, backstory, depth, everything. Every character has relationships, and a villain should too. They should have relationships with the other villains, if you have them, with the protagonists, with people that we haven't even met. Everybody, when they're living their life, bumps into other people and starts relationships accidentally or on purpose. And villains are no different. So explore what depth you can get out of your villains' relationships and include that in your story. It will not only make them feel more grounded in your world, it'll make them feel like an integral part of your story and not just a plot device. Wow, I have been talking for a long time. Maybe I should have just talked about Catra in this video, but we still have 2 to go. Next up, Hordak. Now, I honestly didn't really like or care about Hordak the first time I watched the show. I was like, who's this guy? But I was also like 12, and I don't think I realized the depth that they put into all these characters. I liked Catra because she was a cat. Like, now I hold her up as one of the most thought out villains of all time that I've seen. I thought of Hordak as a flat villain there to push along the plot, when now I realize he's so much more complicated than that. And don't even get me started on Shadow Weaver. Like, there's so much more to these characters on the second watch through because I was older and I was now a writer, but we'll get into that at another point. For now, we're just going to talk about Hordak's character arc and what you can learn from it. Similarly to Catra, Hordak doesn't do anything for himself, and this is a huge part of his character arc. There's one person that he really wants to impress, and that is Horde Prime, but he neither loves this person nor hates them. He does both. Again, very similarly to Catra, he was told that he would amount to nothing and be nothing, and he desperately wants to prove people wrong. He wants to prove to Horde Prime that he's going to amount to so much. But when there's a kind of person who tells you you're going to amount to nothing, it doesn't really matter how much you do, they're never gonna view it as enough. When we first meet Hordak, he seems sort of like a flat plot device villain, but once we start learning about his backstory, he begins to feel like a mirror to Catra, just older and even more bitter. It's not until Entrapta enters the story and befriends him that we really get to see some major character relationship stuff with him. At the end of the day, he's a very complex character, and I wish I'd realized that on the first time watching this show. He doesn't make decisions for himself, and at the end of the day, that's what his arc is about, realizing he has a choice. We get to see him befriend Entrapta, which I absolutely love. Like, their interactions were amazing to me. I loved the two of them being on screen together, and it was heartbreaking when we saw how hurt and betrayed he was when Catra lied and said that she betrayed him. He had finally let someone in. Hordak trusted Entrapta, and he thought that all of that was for nothing. All of that was a ruse. We see these relationships keep pushing our villains to do worse and worse things, to rely on people less and less. And the more that you push people away, and the less that you care, the easier it is to do horrible things. But I think that one of the most interesting things that I saw in my second rewatch of his arc was the self-hatred that he feels. Maybe I'm the only one, but I feel like in almost every scene, we see him failing at something, hating himself, and then Entrapta trying to tell him how amazing it was that he even got as far as he did. When you're told over and over throughout your entire life that you will amount to nothing, that ingrains a certain level of self-hatred in you. And both Catra and Hordak suffer from this throughout the show, and their arcs are about moving past it, living for themselves and not for what other people thought of them. Once again, we get into defense mechanisms. For Catra, it's the cold, callous persona that she presents to the world. And for Hordak, it's the Horde. Every time that he fails, he thinks a little bit less of himself. But look, he has this whole army. He's conquering a world. He's got to be good at something, right? The Horde is Hordak's defense mechanism. It doesn't make him happy, it makes him miserable. But it makes him feel like he can't be a total failure. He's doing what he thinks he's supposed to do instead of what he wants to do. The more that we learn about him, the more that we realize he has other people run the Horde, and he likes to stay in his science lab and work on projects. Character arcs, at the end of the day, are about facing that thing inside yourself that's holding you back and moving past it. And this also applies to villains, whether they end up being redeemed at the end of the story or not. For example, a villain could finally admit to themselves that they're doing things just to gain the attention of someone who will never care. Then move past caring what this person thinks of them and do things that they actually care about, like helping the heroes and trying to stop the person that they once thought they wanted the attention of. They could use their newfound confidence and healthy self-image to be a hero. Or a villainous character could realize that they're being held back by someone they care about, kill that person, and then go off and do even more horrible things. A character arc and a redemption arc aren't the same thing. So whether your character is a villain or a hero, they should all have character arcs. A villain can remain completely evil and still evolve. Next up, I'm going to talk a little bit about Shadow Weaver, hopefully not take 40 minutes, and then I will tell you next steps. If you liked this video, you should subscribe. Obviously that's the next step, but I'll also link you to some videos that might be helpful. First up though, Shadow Weaver. Shadow Weaver is the perfect example of a villain who creates more villains. For example, Catra, and I would say she almost makes Glimmer go down that road too. Same goes for Micah, who she definitely tempts. I wrote down a note in here that I want to perfectly quote. Her motives tend to be two-sided, making them difficult to decipher, and therefore making her a more interesting character, especially a more interesting villain. Does she care about Adora because of her power, or because she's raised her since she was little? Does she mean what she said about being hard on Catra to toughen her up to survive? Or is this another lie made up to use people she only views as tools? Does she take an interest in Glimmer to use her, or because she actually feels some sort of connection to Micah through her? Shadow Weaver's last words to Adora and Catra are, "You're welcome," rather than "I'm sorry," which show her lack of remorse. Even after 5 seasons of atrocities, she still doesn't feel like she did anything wrong. This sums up what's so interesting about Shadow Weaver pretty well in my mind. She is 2 mirror images. She's incredibly interesting, and I wouldn't say she ever is redeemed because, as I said in my little notes section, she does not feel remorse for her actions. She says, "You're welcome," and not "I'm sorry." And while "you're welcome" can be broken down, I could do a whole video about why she may have said "you're welcome," but that's not the focus right now. Shadow Weaver is interesting because you never really know. Was she a terrible parent for Catra because she wanted her to be tough so she could survive because she saw herself in Catra? Or was she just using her and didn't care about her feelings? We will never actually know. Villains can be complex and their motives ambiguous, and this is what's so interesting about them. A character doesn't have to be good to care about something or someone. Shadow Weaver cares about Catra and Adora, though her motives are complicated and often ambiguous, and her care isn't always a positive thing. It's actually negative very often. Why she cares about these two is complicated enough that I could probably write an essay on it. So you might be asking, or maybe this video already answered your question, why do people love villains so much? It's because they're complex. Oftentimes in stories, heroes are one-dimensional and just good. But because villains are bad, they're allowed to have more complicated opinions and motivations and make questionable decisions. They can live in that interesting morally gray area where you can't decide if you love them because they're so terrible or if you love them because they're a redeemable character. Villains, like all characters, can be complex and interesting. If anything, they have even more opportunity to be so. You should put thought into their backstory, their motivations, their character arcs, and of course, if this video has taught you nothing else, their relationships with other characters. Want to dive deeper into this? You can check out the video that sparked this video, What Writers Can Learn from Gravity Falls, The Owl House, Amphibia, and Star vs. the Forces of Evil. I will put it up on the screen, and I talk about Owl House and villains, so. And of course, check out my How to Write Compelling Villains video, because I talk about a lot of this stuff in there, but I also go more specifically into how to do a redemption arc well, with Zuko from Avatar: The Last Airbender as an example. So I'll see you on the next page.